The squad is sitting along one side of a table across from a group of dangerous-looking men and women. Both sides are trying to stare each other down over the impressive array of official-looking documents piled on the table. At a word from Sarge, the squad's melee specialist, Cutter, puts down his chainsword and carefully pulls 3 documents from the pile. Across the table, a woman in a black bodysuit does likewise, and Sarge winces as he sees which ones she's holding. There's a brief whispered argument on both sides of the table, then Doc, glaring daggers at Sarge, picks up a large folder and starts going through it. A large metallic man on the other side immediately grabs a few documents, prompting Twitch, the squad's demolitions expert, to explode out of his chair and lunge across the table. He's stopped by a hand on his collar and a warning shouted by a hooded man sitting off in a corner. Sarge pulls out a few files, shoves them into Twitch's hands, then orders the trooper out of the room. Both sides sit and glare at each other until the hooded figure observing the meeting clears his throat in a menacing way. Sarge gives Nubby, the squad's quartermaster, a meaningful look. Muttering under his breath and moving with exaggerated slowness, Nubby pulls some exotic-looking weapons from a storage case and lays them on the table. At a nudge from Sarge, he also brings up 2 small crates, then sits back and nervously watches as a tall, thin man leans across the table and inspects them. After the thin man sits back down and has a short conversation with his team, Sarge gets to his feet. In a voice trembling a little with nerves, the non-com prepares to make what might be the most important deal of his life. We'll offer these weapons, 2 crates of AMASEC, and we'll handle the combat training for the scribes, in exchange for your team taking all of the psychers. The all-Guardsmen party. Good soldiers, bad educators. So no shit, there we were, on a ship headed out to some nameless Inquisition facility to teach a bunch of fresh recruits how to be proper inquisitorial goons. In our humble opinions, this was stupid as hell. We were definitely goons, but it was hard to find anyone less proper than us. When you hear the term Agents of the Inquisition, you'd usually imagine a bunch of people in billowing cloaks, armed with masterwork power weapons, and acting all dark and mysterious. Maybe they're not all beautiful or darkly handsome, but the ones that aren't are definitely covered with impressive scars and fancy-looking augmetics. You'd expect them to swoop in, interrogate, and possibly torture anyone who looks shifty. Maybe make a few other people disappear, then do something eldritch and fly away into the night. You would not expect a bunch of guardsmen wearing sweaty fatigues and constantly looking either bored, frustrated, or confused. The point is that we didn't look like proper agents. We didn't act like proper agents, and we definitely didn't have any idea how to teach a bunch of recruits to be proper agents. Sure, all of our missions had been relatively successful, but aside from a few tactical situations, we hadn't actually done anything complex. We didn't interrogate people, we didn't assemble theories or hypotheses, and we didn't leverage secret arcane knowledge. We just followed around our superior officer and did what we were told. If investigations were called for, we typically just asked someone who looked smart to do it for us. All we really ever did was stand around until someone screwed up, then applied explosives and live fire to the problem until it was fixed. Well, this seemed to work for us. It definitely wasn't the way things were supposed to be done, and Oak probably wouldn't thank us for teaching the rookies to act like that. This was the worst idea since, well, putting Nubby in charge of buying a ship. Okay, maybe it wasn't that bad. We weren't handling all these rookies' education, just the final polishing. They'd already been through a few months of lessons on the basics of inquisiting. Some of Oak's adepts had already taught them all that boring, what is chaos, where do tyrannids come from, and why heresy is bad stuff. They'd also supposedly be given a rundown of what their general role was, and a few basic lessons on stuff like interrogation and disguises. We were expected to finish that training, though. As experienced field agents, we'd be able to tell them what it was actually like to be on a mission and how to do their jobs correctly. Unfortunately, we didn't even know what those jobs really were, much less how to do them. Luckily, a second team of instructors had been shipped out with us. They were all sleek and professional looking, and had experience in all those aspects of inquisiting that we barely even understood. Ideally, we'd have just handed off all the training to them, but there were too many students and too little time. Both of our teams would just have to split the load as evenly as possible. We were also accompanied by one of Oak's personal interrogators, a quiet fellow who liked to sit in corners and work on data slates. The man didn't actually seem very interested in our mission. He just gave us a basic briefing, handed over the files on the recruits, and then sat and worked on his slate while we hashed things out with the other team. Apparently, the interrogator's job consisted of constantly organizing new groups of trainees, and he'd already started on getting the next group together, which meant he really didn't have any energy to spare on us. He was going to make sure we had a facility to train in and the right group of trainees, but as soon as we were in place, he'd be flying off to set up the next batch, and the next, and the next. Once our classes got started, we wouldn't see him until he showed up for the final review and shipped us all back to Oak. Aside from the initial briefing, our interrogator probably said less than 100 words to our team over the course of the trip. Some people would have been offended by this treatment, but we liked him. He seemed a lot less likely to get us all killed than any of our previous bosses. Instead of bothering our interrogator, we mostly interacted with the other team. They seemed like fairly solid folks, for a bunch of fancy agent types, that is, but they were obviously a little unhappy about our presence on the mission. While they tried to be polite, it was easy to tell that they thought we were a bunch of dim grunts and didn't believe any of our stories about our previous missions. Orders were orders, though. If Oak said that we were half the training team, then they'd make sure we did half the work. We would have settled for a quarter, or maybe an eighth. Trainee records needed to be reviewed, locations needed to be chosen, resources needed to be requested, and duties needed to be assigned, and lessons needed to be planned. As the only responsible members of the squad, Sergeant Doc handled most of this. Nubby was occasionally called in to lend a hand with the requisition paperwork, but Twitch and Cutter were left to do their usual pastimes of paranoid booby-trapping and obsessive sword drills. Now, Sergeant Doc did their best to get us the cushiest jobs, but they were outnumbered and the other team wasn't born yesterday. The crafty buggers weren't going to let us stick them with all the crazies, criminals, and incompetents while we sat around drinking beers with a bunch of well-trained PDF troopers and Arbites. In the end, we all sat down to a negotiation and got the best deal we could. At least we managed to not get stuck with the damn psychers. Our squad would be in charge of 4 batches of trainees. There was a unit of PDF that helped take down a minor demon, and some violent priests who'd burned out a few cults and were probably just being sent to us to get them out of the way. Then there was a group of criminals who were dumb enough to rob an Inquisition warehouse, but smart enough to talk their way out of an execution. And finally, there were the scribes. Those damned scribes. Not all scribes are useless little sissies. Hell, Cutter was a scribe. If he hadn't been handed a chainsword during a pitched fight and subsequently discovered how much more fun being a raging berserker was, he'd probably still be pushing pencils and sorting files. In an extreme situation, the meekest men and women can rise up and become heroes, surprising their enemies with berserk fury or vicious cleverness. Unfortunately, when that heretic cult kidnapped a bunch of administratum scribes and forced them to help translate a demonic text, all the brave ones who fought their captors or sabotaged their translations were immediately killed. The scribes we got were the cowards, the weasels, the dimwits, and the bloody sheep. Not a single one of them was even remotely qualified for any sort of combat. Oak always needed more nerds for field duty, though, and these scribes had enough mental fortitude to translate a chaos tome without going nuts. If we could make fighting men out of any of them, he'd call it a win, even if the rest died in the process. Both our squad and the other team could see what a shit show training these bookworms to fight was going to be. No one wanted to trust them with a butter knife, much less a firearm. It was obviously going to be bad, but all he needed was basic combat training, and our squad could definitely provide that. So while the agents would handle all the assassins, infiltrators, cogboys, and psychers, we'd have the nerds, nuts, grunts, and scum. We touched down after a few weeks of idleness or frantic lesson planning, depending on whether you asked Twitch, Nubby, and Cutter, or Sarge and Doc. The interrogator directed both our squad and the other team to separate flyers and said that the trainees and all our requested material would be waiting for us. As a sort of afterthought, he reminded us that he'd be back in a few months for the final review, and then got back in the shuttle and left. It was reassuring to see that the other team was just as surprised and confused as us by his sudden departure. Everyone stood there and milled around until the shuttle took off and a pair of men walked over from the parked flyers. They asked if there was anything else we needed to do here and reminded us that the trainees were waiting. As we split off to our flyer, Sarge promised to keep in touch with the other team, who, according to our guide, would be operating out of a separate facility half a continent away. This came as a surprise, since none of us had paid that much attention to the location briefing. We'd expected to all be in the same facility and able to work together. Honestly, it was a bit distressing. Our boss had just ditched us, and the people we'd planned on asking for help and advice would be nowhere near us. We were going to be pretty much alone with the trainees. Sergeant Doc began to really worry about the quality of their plans, and the rest of us felt just a little guilty about slacking off. Once we boarded the flyer, our guide introduced himself as one of the interrogator's organizers. There were 4 of them at the facility, a doctor to watch the trainees' health, a pair of tech priests to keep the place running, and him. He was the facility administrator and would be getting everything ready for us. He'd handle all the paperwork, interface with the local authorities for us, and do his best to fulfill any supply requests we made. Twitch immediately asked for several tons of explosives, but Sarge interrupted the administrator before he could finish asking what type. Sarge gave the administrator a quick rundown of who in the squad was considered mentally fit and what constituted a reasonable request. To his credit, the man didn't seem to be worried or confused by any of it. He'd probably worked with teams weirder than us. Hell, there was probably an all-psycher team out there somewhere. The planet we were flying over was reasonably pleasant looking. It seemed to be a moderately developed world with no obvious specialization. There were a few large cities, a few small hives, a major manufactorum or two, and a fair bit of farming. A nice place with a breathable atmosphere and, at least where our base was located, a comfortable climate. According to the admin, there weren't any horrible political crises, religious schisms, gene stealer cults, or major wars currently on the planet. He said there were occasional issues with feral orcs, which made Twitch very unhappy, and of course there were always criminals or minor cults, but this was still the nicest planet we'd ever seen since enlisting. The first thing we saw when we landed and the flyer's doors opened was a big pair of servitors bearing down on us. Twitch immediately opened fire and Cutter drew his sword and began to charge. Luckily, the rest of the squad intervened before any real harm was done. After Doc had explained our previous experience with servitors to a rather annoyed tech priest, the admin introduced us to the rest of the base staff, and we got settled in. Doc went off with a scary-looking doctor lady to look at medical records or something. Sarge got a base tour from the admin and scheduled a morning review of the trainees. Twitch went off with the less annoyed of the two tech priests to inspect the perimeter, while Cutter and Nubby were left with the bags. After making sure both the cargo servitors and the tech priest weren't possessed, they loaded up our gear and went to get the squad's quarters in order. That night we got together, reviewed our lessons, and collectively panicked. In the morning, we marched onto the central training field, looking imposing and professional in our evil goon uniforms. Well, trying to at least. Sarge looked fine, but Doc looked like he was about to throw up. Twitch had spent all night messing with the perimeter defenses. No one had told Cutter to clean his uniform, so it had a fair bit of blood on it. And Nubby looked like Nubby. We weren't sure whether it was a good or bad thing that the trainees didn't look any better. Aside from the PDF, none of them were in matching uniforms. This offended our Guardsmen sensibilities even before we registered what the owners looked like. Their spastic collection of clothing included priestly robes with hand-sewn Inquisition symbols, poorly fitted body gloves, ground-dragging trench coats, several sets of old and battered scribes' robes, and to top it off, two of them had the poor taste to dress up like cadet commissars. They looked like idiots. They milled around on the field like idiots, and what they held in their hands proved they were idiots. Every single one of them was armed. Not just armed, but heavily armed. Someone must have opened up a giant crate of autoguns, hand cannons, and swords, and told everyone to take whatever looked cool. One of the criminals looked like he was carrying over a dozen pistols. An old scribe was struggling to hold up a heavy stubber, and some idiot had let all the tech priests have hand flamers. As we stared at the mob of trainees, we realized that no one had ever heard of trigger discipline, and judging by the flickering pilot lights on those flamers, they hadn't heard of safeties either. Twitch and Nubby tried to casually move behind Sergeant Cutter. Upon seeing such a shameful display, Sarge's NCO instincts kicked in and he started bawling out the recruits. Unfortunately, before he could get up to speed, there was a loud bang followed by a scream. The shouting had surprised one of the scribes, and he'd shot himself in the foot. While Doc hauled the idiot off the field, we had a quick discussion, then Sarge readdressed the trainees in a much quieter voice. After a brief introduction, he ordered everyone to go store their weapons, unloaded, and with the safeties on. Then come back in an hour wearing proper exercise attire. As the mob dispersed, Nubby grabbed one of the PDF troopers and asked him and his squad mates to oversee the weapon storage. 2 self-inflicted gunshot wounds in a day would be a bit much. Eventually, everyone filed back onto the field, mostly disarmed and more appropriately dressed this time. It was tempting to start yelling at them about proper formation and posture, but we understood that those weren't something an Inquisition agent needed, so we skipped over the drill sergeant routine. Sarge reintroduced us, explained what aspects of their training we'd be handling, and then went about splitting everyone into groups based on role and fitness. The general plan was to split each day up between PT, weapons drills, lectures, and team exercises. In theory, everyone would be working together smoothly after a few weeks. Then we could look into more complex exercises, or getting in some outside experts to talk about stuff like cogitators and disguises. That plan fell apart before the first week was over. Every day started with physical training, but instead of Sarge leading everyone through their morning jerks together, they had to split up. Sarge took the few healthy recruits and put them through the usual routine. Twitch did his best with the moderately unfit, and Doc handled the ones that looked like they were going to have a heart attack. This division slowed everything down a lot, and the problem was compounded by the difficulty of getting everyone out onto the field at a reasonable time for PT, which is to say, before dawn. In the Guard, we would have just flipped them out of bed and dragged them to the field, but some of those scribes looked like they were at death's door, and we wanted to get as many of them as possible through the program. As the days went on, PT began to start later and later in the morning. The trainees started sneaking out of Sergeant Twitch's classes. Aside from the PDF and a few scribes who seemed keen on their change of lifestyle, all the little buggers seemed bent on avoiding as much work as possible. If we didn't start keeping an eye on them and send them back, they would all wind up lazing around with Doc's band of old fogies, asthmatics, and land whales. Of course, avoiding hard work was a perfectly understandable goal. In fact, most of us swore by it. But that sort of thinking was supposed to be reserved for proper guardsmen, not trainees. We spent a lot of time forcing the lazy bastards to work, and it didn't endear us to them. If anything, the weapons drills were going worse. Nubby and Cutter were working their asses off, but every damn recruit had a different weapon, and most of them had no clue how to use them. While standard guardsman drills can teach almost anyone how to use a lasgun, they aren't very good for explaining how to use a side-fed autogun, a bolt-action anti-armor rifle, or a bloody crossbow. Nubby spent more time figuring out how to use each trainee's random-ass weapon than teaching them how to actually shoot. Cutter wasn't doing much better with the close-quarters combat training. He couldn't even blame the trainees' random weapons, since after one of the scribes lost a finger during his first lesson, he confiscated everything and handed out wooden sticks. The problem was that everyone was either overexcited or afraid of getting hit. Also, Cutter was just a really bad teacher, and most of the scribes were terrified of him. He was terrible at pulling his blows, looked like he was genuinely trying to murder whoever he was practicing with, and really couldn't explain how to properly use a weapon without demonstrating, at full speed, on a live target. The few trainees that weren't scared shitless thought of Cutter as a complete simpleton, and generally ignored everything he said or wandered off at the first opportunity. Except the priests, that is. Those damn priests took a shine to him, and seemed to think that his berserk fighting style was the best shit ever. Before we knew it, we had a whole group of idiots who thought the best way to fight was by recklessly charging the nearest enemy. This had the side effect of making the scribes afraid of the priests. We never got to the whole lecturing or group exercise part of the plan during the first week. The PT and drills just took too much time. There were over a dozen injuries that week, ranging from sprains to burns to gunshot wounds. Things were not going well, and the trainees' morale was getting low. The scribes were generally terrified and exhausted, and obviously thought of us as a bunch of dumb grunts that were only here to torment them. Most of them seemed sure that this was either some sort of bureaucratic screw-up or a pointless formality before they got cushy desk jobs. As time went on, they got more and more snippy, and none of us could think of any way to deal with the problem without falling back on the guard method, i.e., beating the shit out of anyone who complained. Unfortunately, Sarge and Doc vetoed this solution, on the grounds that the Inquisition probably considered these scribes to be more valuable than the average guard trainee, and would frown on any breakage. On top of this, the scum and priests were developing some worrying habits. The criminals were a relatively minor issue. They'd quickly figured out that we were usually too busy keeping the scribes in line to watch them, and were generally slacking off. They were staying out of the way, but their general contempt for us wasn't doing our reputation any favors, and they persisted in antagonizing all the other recruits. At Doc's suggestion, Nubby was put in charge of winning over his criminal brethren, and explaining the fine line between malingering and malicious lingering. Meanwhile, the priests were developing that special flavor of crazy, mad zealotry with a dash of pyromania that we recognized from every damn inquisitorial cleric we'd worked with. They were far too eager to get a chance to use their flamers on a live target for our liking, and the relationship between them and their less-than-holy fellows was getting rather strained. It was obviously only a matter of time before one of the priests snapped and tried to purify someone, but we weren't exactly sure how to deal with the problem before it happened. Our attempts to convince them to stop being crazy, and detailed explanations of what would happen if they lit anyone on fire without our direct orders, were just met with blank stares and mutters that sounded like "damned is the sympathizer." Finally, and to our considerable surprise, the PDF were causing problems too. Most of them were solid troopers, and we'd have been happy to have them at our back any day of the week. But there were 2 damned cadet commissars mixed in with them, and they were not happy about taking orders from lowly guardsmen. Those 2 commissar wannabes screwed things up to no end. These weren't the fun, happy, drink-and-play cards with the men commissars. These were the ones with the whips. We knew their type. They'd probably been itching for their final promotion so they could start performing field executions without asking permission first. Both of them probably soiled their pants in glee when they got a job offer from the Inquisition. Anyway, they were all set to start climbing the ladder towards becoming the scariest bastards in the Imperium, and then a bunch of lowly guardsmen came along and started bossing them around. They were not happy campers, and neither were we. Our problem was that, as guardsmen, we were bloody well programmed to fear and obey any commissar we met, which made it damned hard to give them orders. Hell, it was all we could do not to salute them. Both of them performed well on the field and range, but they ignored most of our half-hearted orders and bossed around all the other recruits, especially the PDF troopers. Those poor buggers had apparently known the commissars for a while and were absolutely terrified of them. The end result was that our authority began to really suffer, and the trainees' morale dropped even further. We made a few attempts to convince the commissars to behave, but even appeals to the importance of proper discipline and troop morale, which was supposed to be the purpose of commissars in the first place, failed. They just knew with absolute certainty that they were better than us in every way and should have been in charge. Doc suggested transferring them to the other team. Nubby and Twitch were in favor of just shooting them, and Cutter actually liked them since they were good sparring partners. Sarge decided to give it a little longer and see if we couldn't straighten him out. Eventually we got the fitness regimen and weapon drills running smoothly enough for us to devote some time to lectures and team exercises. Neither of these went well. Lectures don't work when the students don't respect their teacher, or believe anything they say for that matter. When we talked about our previous missions, they'd nitpick everything we said, analyzing every stupid decision we made, or pointing out all of the things that couldn't possibly have happened. Twitch got in a heated argument about whether a box full of orcs could possess a regiment of guardsmen, and Cutter decked one of the scribes after he kept pointing out that a Narlock couldn't survive in a spaceship. The priests would interrupt our stories with accusations of heresy, and those damned commissars started riding our asses about not following standard procedures, especially the part where we didn't purge the Orky regiment. The only ones who didn't cause problems were the scum and the PDF troopers, but they seemed more interested in enjoying the stories than learning anything. Instead of serving as a demonstration of effective strategies, our evening story times turned into a sort of horrible, aggravating torture. The practical demonstrations went a bit better, but not much. While it was hard to argue about the truthfulness of a lecture on the planting and diffusal of mines, the students tended to question why it would be their job to worry about that sort of thing when there'd be tech priests around, or guardsmen for that matter. It was damned hard to get the little buggers to understand the importance of being a well-rounded agent instead of a specialist, especially when they could point out that we were pretty damn specialized ourselves. They kept complaining that they were here to learn to be inquisitorial investigators, not guardsmen. Well, except for the PDF troopers. They were fine with the idea of being guardsmen, bless their little olive-drab hearts. The team exercises were a complete fiasco. We'd worked damn hard with the admin and his tech priests to set up realistic combat scenarios, but the trainees seemed hell-bent on ruining them. It wasn't just that they kept failing spectacularly, but they also tended to interrupt things with pointless complaints about the exercise's quality. It's infuriating to hear one of your recruits bitching about the special effects instead of properly covering their teammate. Eventually, we started leading the exercises ourselves, just to keep everyone moving. That stopped most of the complaining, but it's much harder to fix stupid. So almost every run still ended in failure. The big problem was the scribes, who had a tendency to trip over their feet and collapse from exhaustion. They weren't much better when they were upright either. Somehow they managed to shoot their teammates, and occasionally themselves, more often than their targets. It was amazing. If we'd used live rounds, over half the trainees would have died. As it was, the priests managed to torch an entire test area and badly burned a few of their fellows. It was enough to make a guardsman cry, but those test scenarios were nowhere near as bad as the competitive exercises. Imagine a large group of children playing scrum ball. The biggest ones knock over the little ones, the mean ones ganging up on the weak ones, and the bossy ones ordering around the other kids. Now arm everyone. There weren't any deaths, but that was all you could really say for it. There were petty arguments over objectives. Teams would frequently dissolve into infighting. There was no tactical coordination, and no matter who won each exercise, the scribes on both teams lost. Aside from the usual injuries, there were 2 shankings, a few cases of excessive whipping, and one of the clerics bit an ear off. Doc and the base surgeon managed to reattach it, but that scribe wasn't ever going to look at priests the same way after that. We were about ready to cave in and ask the other training team for help, when the administrator told us he'd spotted a nice milk run for our trainees. All of us were ecstatic. We figured a nice, simple combat mission was just what was needed to straighten everyone out. In a way, we were right. The mission did result in a lot of straightening. Just not in the way we thought.